The carriage wheels found every stone on the dusty road to San Gimignano, and our restorer felt each one in his bones. September in Tuscany wore golden clothes that year of 1853, though the political climate remained considerably less warm. The Austrian soldiers he'd passed in Florence seemed like shadows from another world now, as the countryside opened before him in waves of vineyard and olive grove. He shifted the leather case containing his tools, bone folders worn smooth by 20 years of use, Japanese tissue paper worth more than most workers saw in a month, adhesives mixed according to formulas he'd learned as a boy in his master's workshop. These implements had served him through commissions in Rome's papal libraries, in the damp palazzos of Venice, even in that unfortunate incident at the cardinal's residence that still made him wince. Best not to dwell, he thought, though dwelling was precisely what one did on these interminable journeys. The driver, a local man with sun-baked skin like old parchment, gestured toward a hill crowned with cypress trees. Villa Monteverde emerged from the landscape as if it had grown there rather than been built, a sprawling structure of golden stone and terracotta, its wings embracing courtyards that promised coolness even in summer's grip. Our restorer noted the missing tiles on the roof, the garden's subtle wildness that suggested reduced staff. Aristocracy throughout Italy was learning new economies these days. Count Alessandro Monteverde received him in a study that smelled of tobacco and disappointment. The Count stood tall despite his 62 years, maintaining that particular rigidity that suggested military service in youth and pride in decline. His clothes were impeccable but dated, French fashion from the 1830s, maintained with obsessive care. "You come highly recommended," the Count said, though his eyes suggested recommendations were all he could afford. "The Venetian archives, the Medici collection. Though I heard there was some unpleasantness in Rome." Our restorer had expected this. A disagreement about attribution, Excellence. The cardinal preferred a more generous interpretation of a manuscript's origins than honesty permitted. Something flickered in the Count's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit in uncomfortable truths. "Honesty," he repeated, tasting the word. "A luxury few can afford these days. Come, let me show you why you're here." They walked through corridors where portraits of Monteverdi ancestors watched with the particular smugness of those who'd never imagined their legacy might crumble. Servants appeared and vanished like well-trained shadows, though our restorer counted fewer than such a villa should require. The head housekeeper, introduced briefly as Lucia Toretti, possessed the kind of beauty that suggested intelligence had sharpened it into something more interesting than mere prettiness. She looked at him with assessment rather than deference, a merchant's daughter, he guessed, brought in for competence rather than breeding. The library doors were 12 feet tall, carved with scenes from Dante that someone had once gilded. Now the gold flaked away like autumn leaves. The Count produced a key from his waistcoat with ceremonial gravity. 3,000 volumes, he announced as the doors swung open. "Collected over 3 centuries. My family's true treasure." The smell hit first. Mildew and leather rot, mouse droppings, and that particular mustiness of neglect. Sunlight filtered through windows hazed with dirt, illuminating dust motes that danced above chaos. Books lay scattered on reading tables like casualties of some bibliographic battle. Others slumped on shelves, their spines broken, pages splaying obscenely. A restoration artist's nightmare, certainly, but also a strange kind of paradise. Months of work, problems to solve, skills to demonstrate. "Your predecessor," the Count continued, his voice dropping, "was a man named Pietro Galli, brilliant librarian from the University of Pisa. He lasted 3 years before—" The Count paused, choosing words carefully, "before his nerves failed him. He's in Florence now, at the asylum of San Bonifacio. Claims the books whispered to him, told him terrible things about my family, about himself, about God's abandonment of the world." Our restorer kept his expression neutral, though privately he thought 3 years in this decay might drive anyone to imagine voices. Isolation and scholarly pressure can affect sensitive minds, Excellence. Perhaps, the Count didn't sound convinced. You'll stay in the East Wing. Lucia will see to your needs. I require a complete catalog of damage, restoration priorities, and cost estimates within the fortnight. Can you manage that? He could, and said so. The Count departed with visible relief, leaving our restorer alone with 3 centuries of neglect. He walked slowly through the stacks, fingers trailing above, but not quite touching the damaged volumes. Here was a 15th century psalter, its illuminations still brilliant beneath the grime. There, a set of Renaissance treatises on architecture, their bindings oddly heavy. He pulled one free, surprised by its weight, and noticed the unusual thickness of the covers. That first evening, Lucia Toretti served his dinner in a small dining room overlooking the valley. The sun painted the landscape amber and rose, and she moved through the light with practiced efficiency. "You're not afraid of the whispers, then?" she asked, setting down a plate of wild boar ragout. "Should I be?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Pietro was a rational man, too. University educated, published in journals. He used to say superstition was the enemy of progress. And now? Now he lives in an asylum, having conversations with people who aren't there. She paused at the door, though perhaps that's not so different from what we all do in our way. That night, settling into a bed that had hosted generations of guests, our restorer listened to the villa's nocturnal symphony. Old buildings had their own voices. Wood settling, stones contracting, wind finding gaps in windows. But there was something else, too, a rustling that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Mice, he told himself firmly, though he'd never known mice to sound quite so much like whispers. Morning brought the kind of light that made restoration work possible, clear but not harsh, revealing without condemning. Our restorer arrived at the library to find Don Bernardino already there, a priest whose cassock had seen better decades and whose face suggested he'd heard too many confessions to be surprised by anything anymore. "Forgive the intrusion," the priest said, though his tone suggested he was used to being forgiven. "I taught the Count's son his letters in this room many years ago. Sometimes I come here to remember better days." The restorer noticed how the priest's fingers traced the edge of a reading table, finding grooves worn by generations of scholarly elbows. The Count mentioned a son. "Is he traveling?" "Dead these 5 years," Don Bernardino replied simply. "A hunting accident, they said, though young Federico never showed much interest in hunting while alive." The priest's eyes held questions he clearly wouldn't voice. "But you're not here to excavate family tragedies. You're here for the books." Together, they walked the library's perimeter while the priest provided commentary that mixed historical detail with careful omissions. That section held the Count's grandfather's collection of alchemical texts. He had peculiar interests for an Enlightenment man. Those shelves contained account books from the estate's more prosperous years, when we employed 40 souls, not the current dozen. Near the library's heart, they discovered Pietro Galli's journal, abandoned on a lectern like evidence at a crime scene. The restorer opened it carefully, finding pages covered in increasingly erratic handwriting. The early entries showed meticulous cataloging work, careful notes about temperature and humidity, restoration priorities clearly outlined. Then, around the 2-year mark, the tone shifted. "They speak when no one is here," Pietro had written. "Accusations in Latin, confessions in dialect." Yesterday, I heard young Federico discussing debts with someone, but Federico is dead, and the voice came from the Summa Theologica. Don Bernardino read over his shoulder, crossing himself reflexively. Poor Pietro, such a brilliant mind reduced to this. Later entries grew worse. The books know what the Count did. They whisper about blood money and Austrian bribes, about Federico's shame, about my own sins, which I thought long buried. How can leather and paper know such things? The restorer closed the journal gently. In his experience, madness often began with isolation and bloomed in places where the past pressed too heavily on the present. This library certainly qualified. "Tell me about Pietro," he said to the priest, before the whispers started. Don Bernardino settled into a chair that groaned with age. "Meticulous, perhaps too much so. He'd spend 18 hours here daily, barely eating. Lucia would bring him meals he'd forget to consume. He became obsessed with certain volumes, particularly the old architectural treatises. Said they were unusually heavy, spent weeks studying their bindings." This caught the restorer's attention. He remembered those same treatises from yesterday, their unexpected weight. Moving to that section, he pulled one free, a 16th century volume on Roman aqueducts. The binding was indeed peculiar, far heavier than the paper within justified. "Pietro examined these?" he asked, running fingers along the spine. "Constantly. He even took one apart, claimed the binding was hollow. The Count was furious. Those books are 300 years old. It was the beginning of the end, really. After that, Pietro's behavior grew increasingly erratic." The restorer made a mental note to examine these volumes more carefully, though he kept his expression neutral. "And the Count brought in no one else until now?" "Who would come? Word spreads in academic circles." "A librarian gone mad, claiming supernatural persecution? Not exactly encouraging for potential successors." That afternoon, working alone, the restorer began his systematic catalogue. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. Water stains from a roof leak since fixed, mouse damage to lower shelves, general degradation from humidity and neglect. Yet the collection itself was magnificent. Illuminated manuscripts from dissolved monasteries, Renaissance treatises on everything from astronomy to cooking, correspondence between Medici princes and Monteverdi ancestors. As shadows lengthened, he heard footsteps on the marble floor. Lucia appeared with coffee and bread, moving through the chaos with practiced grace. "You're braver than you look," she observed, setting the tray on a clear corner of desk. "Most men would have fled after reading Pietro's journal." "Most men haven't spent 20 years in Italian libraries." "I've seen worse than theoretical whispers," she laughed, a sound that transformed her face from merely beautiful to genuinely interesting. "Theoretical? You haven't heard them yet? Have you?" Her expression grew careful.
I've heard many things in this house, some real, some imagined, some somewhere between. The question isn't what you hear, but what you choose to believe." After she left, the restorer continued working until the light failed entirely. Lighting an oil lamp, he made his final notes for the day. It was then, in that peculiar quiet that comes when work ends and contemplation begins, that he heard it. A voice, muffled and distant, speaking rapidly in the local dialect. It seemed to come from the far wall, from behind a section of theological texts. He approached slowly, lamp held high. The voice continued, rising and falling in what sounded like argument. Then another voice joined it, younger, more agitated.
The conversation was real. He could make out words about grain prices, about Austrian patrols, about someone's daughter who'd run off to Florence. But the wall was solid stone, the nearest room supposedly empty. He pressed his ear against the spines of books, and the voices grew clearer, as if the books themselves were conducting sound from somewhere else entirely. His rational mind supplied explanations, acoustic phenomena, sound carrying through old stone in unexpected ways. Yet, standing there in the lamplight, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, he began to understand how Pietro might have thought the books themselves were speaking. That night at dinner, the Count joined him, anxious for preliminary assessments. The restorer provided honest but diplomatic answers. The collection was salvageable, but would require significant investment, both in time and materials. The Count nodded, his face showing the strain of someone calculating costs he couldn't afford.
"And the atmosphere?" the Count asked carefully. "Has it disturbed your work?" "Old buildings have their quirks, Excellence. Nothing that prevents restoration." The October sun cast long rectangles of light across the library floor when young Marco Santini arrived, carrying himself with the peculiar mix of eagerness and trepidation that marked ambitious provincial youth. The Count had approved hiring an assistant, at wages that suggested either charity or desperation, and the boy came recommended by Don Bernardino as clever with his hands and discreet with his tongue. "My grandmother says this place is cursed," Marco announced within his first hour, then immediately reddened. "Not that I believe such things. I've been to school." Our restorer smiled, remembering his own youth, caught between village wisdom and scholarly aspiration. "Your grandmother is partially right."
This place is cursed with neglect, which is far more destructive than any supernatural affliction. He set the boy to work cleaning, teaching him to distinguish between dirt that could be safely removed and patina that must be preserved. Marco proved quick to learn, his fingers surprisingly delicate for someone who'd grown up working his family's vineyard. While they worked, the boy shared village gossip with the unconscious generosity of youth, whose olive harvest had failed, which families were negotiating marriages, how Austrian patrols had decreased since spring, but everyone knew they still had informants in town. "My sister works at the osteria," Marco confided while carefully brushing dust from a Byzantine psalter. "She says men come through speaking of changes in Florence, in Rome. That Italy will truly be Italy soon, not this patchwork of foreign rulers and old nobles." The restorer kept his attention on the damaged binding he was examining, though he listened carefully. In his travels, he'd heard such talk everywhere, the Risorgimento's promise filtering down from intellectual circles to ordinary people who just wanted to sell their goods without paying 3 different taxes to 3 different authorities. "Change is inevitable," he replied carefully. "But books endure regardless of who rules. That's why we preserve them." It was while teaching Marco to prepare wheat paste, that fundamental adhesive of the restoration trade,
that they made the first real discovery. The boy had accidentally knocked over a stack of those unusually heavy architectural treatises, and one had split along its spine, revealing what Pietro Galli had suspected. The binding was indeed hollow. Not merely hollow, but carefully constructed with an internal chamber that opened into a narrow channel running through the spine. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Whoever had created these bindings possessed skills beyond ordinary bookbinding. The restorer held the damaged volume to the light, peering into the cavity. It was clean, no dust or debris, as if air regularly moved through it.
"Should we tell the Count?" Marco asked, nervous at this destruction of property. "First, we understand what we're seeing. Knowledge before revelation. Remember that principle." They spent the afternoon carefully examining other volumes with similar heft, finding 12 in total with these hollow bindings scattered throughout the library without apparent pattern. Some were architectural texts, others theological treatises. One was even a cookbook from the 1700s. The only commonality was their age, all dated from the library's major expansion in the 1750s, when the current Count's grandfather had renovated the villa. Lucia arrived with their midday meal, finding them surrounded by carefully opened books like surgeons with multiple patients. Her eyes took in the scene with quick intelligence. "So you found them," she said simply. The restorer looked up sharply. "You knew?" "Pietro showed me before his mind departed. He thought they were conduits for evil spirits." She picked up one of the hollow bindings with casual familiarity. "I thought they were simply old books damaged by worms in interesting patterns." But her tone suggested she believed neither explanation. She set down the tray with practiced efficiency, then surprised them by sitting down, abandoning the formal distance of servant to employer. "My grandfather was a builder," she said. "He worked on villa renovations throughout Tuscany. He used to tell stories about the peculiar requests nobles made, hidden passages for escape during uprisings, concealed chambers for valuables, elaborate acoustic tricks to impress or spy on guests." The restorer felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Acoustic tricks, speaking tubes hidden in walls. Whispering galleries, where words spoken in one room could be heard clearly in another. The 18th century aristocracy loved such novelties. They had wealth, time, and paranoia in equal measure. That evening, after Marco had departed and Lucia returned to her duties, the restorer worked alone in the library with new purpose. If these hollow bindings were part of an acoustic system, there should be evidence in the walls, the shelving, the very architecture of the room. He found it behind a section of patristic texts, a small brass grating, painted to match the darkened wood, nearly invisible unless one knew to look. Pressing his ear against it, he heard nothing at first. Then gradually, the sounds of the villa's evening life filtered through. Servants preparing dinner, someone praising the season's wine, a woman humming a popular aria from Bellini. The hollow books, he realized, were acoustic amplifiers. When properly positioned on the shelves, their internal chambers would align with these hidden openings, catching and channeling sound. Move them, and the effect would cease. But when they were in their original positions that Pietro must have discovered through obsessive trial and error, they would indeed seem to whisper. Don Bernardino appeared in the doorway, his evening visit having become routine. "You look like a man who's solved a puzzle but discovered a larger mystery." The restorer showed him the brass grating, explained the hollow bindings. The priest's expression grew grave.
The old Count, Alessandro's grandfather, was said to be extremely protective of family interests. He lived through the Austrian succession wars, saw friends become enemies overnight. Perhaps he felt the need to know what was being said in his own house. And Pietro discovered this system? Pietro discovered something.
Whether it was this or whether this led him to something else, the priest shrugged eloquently. That night, unable to sleep, the restorer walked the villa's corridors with new awareness. How many conversations had traveled through hidden tubes to be amplified in hollow books? How many secrets had the old Count collected, sitting alone in his library, seemingly reading while actually listening to his household's private moments? He found himself at Lucia's door, not intentionally, he told himself, merely lost in the unfamiliar hallways. Light showed beneath it, and he heard her voice, speaking to someone about accounts that didn't balance, about creditors growing impatient, about the Count's refusal to sell land that no longer produced enough to maintain itself. Then another voice responded, male, younger, speaking urgently about meetings in Florence, about men willing to pay well for information about Austrian sympathizers among the nobility.
The restorer recognized neither voice as any servant he'd met, yet they seemed to come from Lucia's room. Unless, he realized with a chill, they came from somewhere else entirely, carried through hidden channels to emerge where? He looked up and down the corridor, noting the decorative moldings that could easily conceal speaking tubes, the portraits whose frames might hide acoustic openings. Villa Monteverdi was not just a house with a library, it was an enormous listening device, constructed by a paranoid genius and left to confuse and terrify subsequent generations who didn't understand its nature. October 1st brought unseasonable rain that drummed against the library windows like impatient fingers. Our restorer had arranged 12 hollow books on the central table, their damaged bindings splayed open like anatomical specimens. Marco held a lamp while the older man carefully probed the internal chambers with a thin brass rod, borrowed from the villa's neglected music room.
Listen, the restorer instructed, tapping the rod against the chamber's interior. The sound resonated, pure and clear, each book producing a slightly different tone.
They're tuned, like organ pipes.
The boy's eyes widened with understanding.
So, when sound enters them, they amplify specific frequencies while muffling others. Brilliant engineering, really. Whoever designed this understood acoustics better than most university professors.
They were interrupted by Lucia's arrival with correspondence from Florence. Her dress was damp from rain, and she brought the smell of autumn with her, wet leaves and wood smoke. She paused at their display, her expression unreadable.
"The Count requests a progress report," she said, handing over the letters. "His creditors grow insistent."
The restorer noticed how her fingers lingered on the papers, how her eyes never quite met his.
"Tell His Excellence that restoration proceeds, but I've discovered structural considerations that require careful documentation."
She nodded, then surprised him by approaching the table. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, she lifted one of the hollow books, holding it to her ear like a seashell. "When I was young, before coming here, my mother cleaned houses for the wealthy. She used to say every great house had two faces. One it showed to guests, another it kept for family." And which face are we seeing now? Neither. We're seeing the bones beneath both faces. She set the book down gently. "Be careful what you uncover. Some knowledge carries obligations." After she departed, they continued their investigation.
The restorer had Marco hold different books at various angles while he spoke into them, mapping how sound traveled through the chambers. It was during one such experiment that they heard it, a conversation conducting through the very book Marco held.
"Shipment arrives Thursday," a man's voice said, distant but distinct. "The Austrian papers must be perfect. And if they inspect the crates," another voice, nervous, "they won't. The customs officer is one of ours." Marco nearly dropped the book. The restorer steadied his hands, pressing a finger to his lips for silence. They listened as the conversation continued. Discussion of routes through the Apennines, of sympathizers in Modena, of weapons disguised as farm equipment. "Revolutionary talk," Marco whispered after the voices faded. "In this house?" The restorer's mind raced. The voices had been clear, contemporary, not echoes from the past. Someone in the villa was involved in the underground movement against Austrian rule, using the Count's own ancestral spy system. Don Bernardino arrived for his evening visit, finding them tense with discovery. The priest's sharp eyes took in their expressions, the carefully arranged books, the notes covered hastily with blank paper. "You've heard them," he said. It wasn't a question. "You knew?" The priest settled into a chair with the weariness of someone carrying too many secrets. "I suspected. Pietro heard confession from half the district before his departure. People tell priests things they'd never tell authorities. The question becomes, what does one do with such knowledge? Report sedition to the Count, surely," the restorer said carefully. "Testing." Don Bernardino's laugh was bitter. "Report to a Count whose son died mysteriously? Whose debts to Austrian bankers keep this villa from auction? Whose own loyalties shift with the wind?" He stood, moving to the rain-streaked window. Some of us remember when Federico was alive. Idealistic boy, full of Mazzini's writings, talking of Italian unity. Then, suddenly, he's dead in a hunting accident, and his father has Austrian gold to repair the roof. The implications hung in the air like incense. The restorer thought of the Count's careful courtesy, his desperate need for the library's restoration, his questions about what had been discovered. Was he seeking to recover his surveillance system, or to ensure it remained buried? That night, working alone, the restorer made a methodical map of the library, marking each location where he'd found evidence of the acoustic system. The pattern that emerged was ingenious. Speaking tubes hidden throughout the villa converged here, their terminus points concealed behind centuries of accumulated books. The hollow volumes, when properly positioned, would capture and amplify these sounds, making them seem to emanate from the books themselves. He was so absorbed that he didn't hear Lucia enter until she spoke. "You're working late." She carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, a breach of propriety that suggested either unusual trust or calculated risk. "The Count's visiting his bankers tomorrow. The servants are abed." "We can speak freely." They sat in the pool of lamplight while rain continued its percussion against the windows. She poured wine, good wine, probably from the Count's private reserve. "How much do you actually know?" he asked. "Everything and nothing. I know the Count's debts could bury 3 villas. I know his son died with a bullet in his brain, not a hunting accident. I know Pietro found something in this library that terrified him into madness, real or performed." She took a sip of wine, considering. "I know you're not just a restorer. You're too careful with your words, too observant of things beyond books.
And you're not just a housekeeper.
No, she smiled sadly. I'm a merchant's daughter with education but no dowry, managing a noble household that can barely pay its servants. I'm also someone who believes Italy deserves better than Austrian bureaucrats and decrepit aristocrats.
The voices we heard today
Are none of your concern. Her tone was steel beneath silk.
Focus on your books. Complete your restoration. Take your payment and leave before you understand too much. But even as she warned him, her hand found his across the table. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work, real in a way that nothing else in the villa seemed to be. They sat in silence, listening to rain and the subtle whispers that might have been wind in the speaking tubes, or might have been the villa itself breathing through its hidden channels. Pietro loved a woman in the village, she said suddenly. A widow, respectable but poor. He wanted to marry her, leave the villa, teach at a local school. Then he discovered the acoustic system, started hearing things. The Count convinced him his duty was to scholarship, to preserving the collection. Pietro chose duty over love, and it drove him mad. Or he chose madness over duty, the restorer suggested. She squeezed his hand once, then stood. Perhaps.
Either way, he's gone and we're here, surrounded by whispers we can't unhear. Alone again, the restorer extinguished his lamp and sat in darkness. The rain had stopped, and in the silence he could hear them. Fragments of conversation flowing through the hidden network, a dozen private moments made public by centuries-old paranoia. He thought of Pietro, sitting here night after night, slowly realizing that the books really were speaking, just not in the way anyone imagined. Tomorrow, he decided, he would trace the speaking tubes to their sources. He would map this entire system, understand its full scope. The villa's architectural plans lay scattered across the library floor like fallen leaves, their edges weighted with volumes of Vitruvius to keep them flat.
Our restorer had found them in a chest beneath dust-covered treatises on hydraulics, rolled sheets dating from the 1750 renovation that transformed Villa Monteverdi from a modest country house into its current sprawling form. Marco knelt beside him, tracing pencil lines with one finger. "These walls don't match," the boy observed, comparing the plans to their current surroundings. "Look, this shows solid stone, but we found the speaking tube there yesterday." Indeed, the official plans bore little resemblance to reality. Where drawings showed simple walls, they'd discovered hollow channels. Where windows were marked, they'd found decorative panels concealing acoustic openings. Either the plans were deliberately falsified or a second, secret construction had followed the public one. "My grandfather mentioned this," Marco said suddenly. He told stories about builders who worked only at night during the old Count's renovation, craftsmen brought from Rome who spoke no local dialect, who stayed apart from the regular workers. The restorer made careful notes, adding measurements to his growing map. They'd spent the morning with strings and chalk, marking sight lines between hollow books and wall openings, discovering that the entire library functioned as an enormous ear, capable of collecting sounds from throughout the villa and focusing them here, where an attentive listener could monitor his domain. Lucia appeared at midday, but not with food. She carried a ledger, her expression troubled. "The Count returns tonight. His meeting with creditors went poorly. He'll want to see substantial progress. I can show restoration work on several valuable manuscripts," the restorer offered. "He won't care about that." She set down the ledger. Household accounts, he noticed, figures in red overwhelming those in black. "He's been asking about Pietro's research.
about what specific books he was studying before his breakdown. He's particularly interested in whether you found any unusual features in the collection. The warning in her eyes was clear. The Count knew about the acoustic system, or at least suspected its existence. The question became, what did he intend to do with such knowledge? After Lucia departed, they returned to their investigation with new urgency. Following the speaking tubes required entering the walls themselves through servant passages the restorer had barely noticed before. These narrow corridors ran between rooms, allowing staff to move unseen, but they also housed the brass tubes that carried sound throughout the villa. In the dusty darkness, holding candles that threw dancing shadows, they traced the network to its various sources. One tube led to the Count's study, another to the main salon, a third descended to the wine cellars.
But the most elaborate branch headed upward, toward the family quarters. "We shouldn't be here," Marco whispered as they climbed narrow stairs between walls. The restorer agreed, but continued anyway. His craftsman's pride demanded understanding the full scope of this construction, this masterwork of paranoid architecture. They emerged in an attic space beneath the villa's roof, where dozens of tubes converged in a hidden chamber no larger than a confessional. Here was the system's heart, a listening post, where someone could monitor every conducted sound simultaneously. A chair stood in the center, its leather cracked with age, surrounded by the brass mouths of speaking tubes labeled in fading ink, blue salon, kitchen, east bedroom, chapel. The old Count sat here, Marco breathed, listening to everyone. But dust patterns suggested recent disturbance. Someone had been using this chamber, probably within the past month. The restorer examined the chair, finding threads caught on a splinter, black wool, fine quality, from expensive clothing. They descended in thoughtful silence, returning to the library as afternoon shadows lengthened. Don Bernardino waited there, his usual composure fractured. "You must stop this investigation," he said without preamble. "The Count returns in an angry mood. Word from the village is that Austrian authorities have been asking about revolutionary activities, about weapons smuggling. They suspect this region harbors conspirators." "And does it?" the restorer asked directly. The priest's face was stone. "Every region of Italy harbors those who dream of unity. The question is whether dreams become actions, and whether those actions bring liberation or merely bloodshed." "You didn't answer my question, because answers have consequences." Pietro sought answers. Now he discusses philosophy with madmen, while his beloved married another. That evening the Count indeed returned, his mood dark as Don Bernardino had warned. At dinner he questioned the restorer closely about progress, his eyes never quite focusing, as if listening to something beyond their conversation. "You've been thorough," he said, cutting his meat with precise violence. "My housekeeper tells me you've explored areas of the library previous restorers ignored." "Damage assessment requires complete investigation, Excellence." "Indeed. And what damage have you assessed?" The restorer chose his words like a man crossing a frozen lake. "The collection suffers from standard deterioration. Moisture, pests, simple age. But the bones of the library remain sound. With proper treatment, these books will outlive us all." "Books do tend to outlive their owners," the Count agreed.
They also remember things their owners might prefer forgotten. He set down his knife carefully. Tell me, in your professional opinion, can damaged things be truly restored, or do they simply learn to hide their damage better? Everything bears marks of its history, Excellence. Restoration isn't erasure, it's stabilization, allowing the past to coexist with the present without causing further harm. The Count studied him for a long moment. A philosopher as well as a craftsman, how refreshing. He stood abruptly. Continue your work, but remember, some damage is better left undiscovered. Some systems, once understood, create obligations to act on that understanding. I would hate for you to find yourself in Pietro's position. The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. After the Count retired, the restorer sat alone in the library, surrounded by whispers he now understood too well.
Through the acoustic network came fragments of the villa's evening life. Servants discussing the Count's debts, someone praying in the chapel, and underneath it all, a conversation in the wine cellar about moving packages through the mountain passes before the Austrian patrols increased. He thought about Lucia's warning, about Don Bernardino's fear, about Pietro's madness. The acoustic system was more than an architectural curiosity. It was a weapon that could destroy everyone it observed, depending on who controlled it and how they chose to use their knowledge. Marco had left his notebook on the table, filled with innocent sketches of damaged bindings and repair techniques. The restorer added his own notes in the margins, documenting what they'd discovered in language that would seem like restoration terminology to casual readers, but would preserve the truth for anyone who knew how to read between the lines.
October 20th arrived with fog that wrapped Villa Monteverdi in gauze, muffling the external world while somehow amplifying internal sounds. Our restorer stood before a section of the library he'd previously ignored. Architectural portfolios, too large for regular shelves, stored flat in wooden drawers. Among them, he'd discovered something that made his hands tremble slightly as he lifted it. Original construction drawings from 1752, annotated in two different hands. The first hand wrote in formal Italian, noting measurements and materials. The second used Latin and symbols from Hermetic traditions, describing something far more complex than simple renovation. Marco peered over his shoulder, struggling with the archaic script. Theatrum Secretum, the boy read slowly. Secret theater? Theater of secrets, the restorer corrected. Look here, these calculations describe acoustic properties, how sound waves travel through specific materials, how to create zones of amplification and nullification. The drawings showed the villa in cross-section, revealing it as an intricate machine for gathering and channeling information. Every room connected to the network, but not equally. Some spaces were designed to transmit, others to receive, and a few, marked with alchemical symbols, seemed intended to distort or trap sound entirely. Don Bernardino entered without his usual announcement, moving with urgency that disrupted his priestly dignity. "You must come! There's been an incident in the village." They followed him through fog-shrouded gardens to the estate's chapel, where Lucia waited with a young man the restorer didn't recognize. Blood stained the stranger's shirt, and his face showed the pallor of shock. "Austrian patrol," Lucia explained tersely. "They were searching for contraband, found pamphlets instead." 3 arrested, including the printer. "Why bring him here?" the restorer asked, though he suspected the answer. "Because the villa is the last place they'd search," Don Bernardino said. The Count's debts to Austrian banks make him seem a reliable ally. The wounded man spoke through gritted teeth. The codes were in the library. Pietro told us before they took him away. Said the old books contained ciphers for the movement. The restorer felt pieces clicking together with uncomfortable clarity. Pietro hadn't gone mad from hearing whispers. He'd discovered the villa's acoustic system was being used by revolutionaries, possibly with Lucia's knowledge, possibly even with the Count's tacit permission. His breakdown, real or performed, removed him from an impossible position between duty and conscience. They tended the man's wound, a grazing from an Austrian rifle, while he explained more.
The revolutionary network used Villa Monteverdi as a communication hub, its acoustic system allowing them to exchange information without physical meetings. Messages spoken in certain rooms would carry to the library, where sympathizers could collect them from the hollow books. "But surely the Count must know," Marco protested. "The Count knows what he chooses to know," Lucia said carefully. "His debts protect him from Austrian suspicion, while his noble status shields him from revolutionary violence. He walks a razor's edge between both sides." The restorer returned to the architectural drawings with new understanding. The old Count hadn't built this system just for spying on his household. He'd created a tool for controlling information flow during the Austrian succession wars, selling intelligence to whatever side paid best. His paranoid masterpiece had outlived its creator, becoming something he never intended: infrastructure for Italian independence. That afternoon, while Marco helped move the wounded revolutionary to safer quarters, the restorer discovered another layer to the mystery. Hidden within the binding of a treatise on Palladian architecture, he found documents that weren't part of the acoustic system, but rather records of its use. The old Count had indeed listened to his household, keeping meticulous notes in a cipher based on architectural measurements. One entry, dated 1794, chilled him. "Federico speaks treason at dinner. His young mind, poisoned by French ideas, must be watched." Another, from 1800, "Wife meets priest privately, discussing my soul or her loneliness. Both require intervention." But most disturbing were recent entries in a different hand, the current Count's. He'd discovered his grandfather's system years ago and used it to monitor his own son's growing revolutionary sympathies. The final entry, dated just days before young Federico's death, read, "F. Plans to sell library to fund Mazzini's cause. Cannot permit destruction of family legacy. God forgive what must be done." The restorer closed the book carefully, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The Count had killed his own son to preserve the very library he now couldn't afford to maintain. The debts to Austrian banks weren't just financial necessity. They were blood money, payment for covering up a murder, disguised as hunting accident. Evening brought an unexpected visitor. The Count himself, appearing in the library with uncharacteristic informality. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, cravat askew, wine stains on his cuff. "You've been thorough in your investigations," he said, words slightly slurred. "More thorough than I hired you to be." Proper restoration requires understanding the complete context, Excellence. The Count laughed bitterly. "Context? Yes, we're all products of context, aren't we? My grandfather built this listening machine to protect family interests. I used it for the same purpose. Yet here we are, bankrupt and compromised, our secrets echoing through tubes meant to capture others' indiscretions. He moved to the window, gazing into fog that obscured even the nearest trees. Do you know what it's like? Listening to your son plan your family's destruction. Hearing him call you a relic, an embarrassment to Italy's future. The books told me everything. His meetings, his promises to revolutionaries, his plan to auction our history to the highest bidder. So you stopped him. I preserved him. Federico died believing in something beautiful instead of living to see it fail. The revolution will come, yes, but it won't bring the paradise he imagined. It will bring different masters with different lies. The Count turned back, his eyes focused with drunk precision. Complete your restoration, but know this: I hear everything in this house. Every whisper, every confession, every little conspiracy. The revolutionaries think they use my villa, but I use them, selling just enough information to my creditors to keep them satisfied. Everyone serves the library's preservation, whether they know it or not. After he left, the restorer sat in darkness, listening to the villa's nighttime chorus through its hidden channels. Somewhere, Lucia was tending the wounded revolutionary. Somewhere else, Don Bernardino prayed for guidance. And throughout it all, the Count sat in his study, drunk and grieving, master of a machine that had mastered him. The books continued their whispers, carrying secrets through hollow chambers and brass tubes, indifferent to the human drama they facilitated. The journey to Florence required 2 days through autumn countryside that seemed to mock their serious purpose with its beauty. Our restorer traveled with Marco, having convinced the Count that examining Pietro Galli's personal effects at the asylum might reveal crucial information about the library's conservation needs. The Count, still suffering from his confessional evening, had agreed with the exhausted gesture of someone beyond caring. The asylum of San Bonifacio occupied a former monastery on Florence's outskirts, its gardens maintained with the obsessive precision that suggested patients' labor as therapy. A young doctor, progressive in his methods and skeptical of traditional treatments, received them in an office that smelled of carbolic and scholarly ambition. Signor Galli is one of our more interesting cases, Dr. Torini explained, consulting his notes. His madness, if we can call it that, is remarkably selective. He demonstrates perfect lucidity on most topics: literature, history, philosophy. But mention Villa Monteverdi, and he becomes agitated, speaking of books that know sins, walls that remember crimes. May we speak with him? Certainly, he enjoys visitors, though I should warn you, he's developed an elaborate fantasy about acoustic phenomena and architectural conspiracy. Quite detailed, actually. In different circumstances, it might make an entertaining novel. They found Pietro in the garden, tending roses with the careful attention of someone who'd transferred his professional precision to new subjects. At 45, he appeared older, his hair completely gray, his hands marked with small scars from thorns he didn't seem to notice. When he saw the restorer, his eyes sharpened with recognition of a fellow craftsman. "They sent someone else to the library," Pietro said without preamble. "I wondered when you'd come." The restorer sat on the garden bench beside him, noting how Pietro positioned himself to watch all approaches, habits of paranoia that might not be paranoia at all. "I need to understand what you discovered." Pietro laughed, a sound like paper tearing.
Discovery implies something hidden that gets revealed. What I found was never hidden. We simply agreed not to see it. He glanced at Marco, then back to the restorer. You found the hollow books? Yes. And the speaking tubes, those too. But have you found the silences? Pietro leaned closer, his voice dropping. The places where sound should carry but doesn't. The conversations that disappear mid-sentence. The old Count didn't just build a system for listening. He built one for selective deafness, for making certain truths unhearable. The restorer thought of those architectural drawings, the zones marked with hermetic symbols.
The acoustic nullification chambers. Ah, you're quicker than I was. It took me 2 years to understand. Certain rooms in the villa are designed to trap sound completely. Confessions spoken there, crimes admitted, plans discussed. They vanish into specially constructed walls that break sound waves apart. The perfect place for necessary evils. Pietro returned to his roses, pruning dead blooms with practiced efficiency. I found transcripts the old Count kept, encoded in marginalia throughout the collection. He documented everything he heard, but also everything he ensured would never be heard. Murders planned in the Blue Salon that no testimony could confirm. Business arrangements in the old study that legally never happened. And the current Count? Pietro's hands stilled. Federico was my friend. Idealistic boy full of fire for Italy's future. He'd meet with revolutionaries in what he thought were secret gatherings, never knowing his father heard every word through the listening system. But the Count also heard Federico's genuine love for the people, his desire to use the family's wealth for education, for hospitals, for lifting the poor from their misery. The gardener's shears caught sunlight as Pietro continued. The Count faced a choice. Let his son destroy the family legacy for noble but naive purposes, or preserve that legacy through ignoble but practical means. He chose preservation. He always chooses preservation. You could have exposed this, Marco said, his young voice tight with indignation. Pietro smiled sadly. To whom? The Austrian authorities who'd use it to destroy Italian nobles? The revolutionaries who'd burn the villa and its library for symbolism? The church that has its own secrets? He shook his head. I chose madness instead. Here, I harm no one. My roses don't whisper secrets. The walls don't remember. Dr. Turini appeared, suggesting their time was limited. As they prepared to leave, Pietro grabbed the restorer's wrist with surprising strength. The library contains a final secret, he whispered urgently. In the Dante volumes, first edition, Canto 33 of Paradiso. The old Count hid something there, not in the binding, but in the words themselves, a confession that explains everything, including why the acoustic system must never be fully revealed. On the journey back to Villa Monteverdi, the restorer pondered Pietro's words. The man's madness was clearly a performance, a self-imposed exile from an impossible situation. But his information was precise, verifiable. That evening, while Marco slept, the restorer found the Dante volumes Pietro had mentioned. The first edition of Paradiso was magnificent, its vellum pages still supple after centuries. In Canto 33, Dante attempts to describe the indescribable, the direct vision of God that transcends human language. The old Count had added marginal notes in nearly invisible ink, visible only at certain angles. The confession was there, written in architectural cipher. The old count had discovered something that threatened not just his family, but the entire system of noble houses, Austrian control, even church authority. The acoustic system had captured evidence of a conspiracy so vast that revealing it would have triggered revolution decades before Italy was ready. So he'd built the nullification chambers, destroyed the evidence, and created a tool that could be used for control rather than revelation. "Knowledge is not wisdom," the old count had written. "Wisdom is knowing which knowledge must remain unknown." Lucia found him there at dawn, still reading. She brought coffee and bread, sitting beside him with a casual intimacy that had grown between them despite propriety. "You look like Pietro did near the end," she observed, when understanding became unbearable. "He chose madness as escape. What did you choose?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "Purpose. The revolutionaries need the villa's network, even if they don't fully understand it. The Count needs someone to manage his household while he drinks himself toward oblivion. I serve both, betraying neither, helping Italy inch toward freedom while keeping this house from collapse. And when the revolution comes? Then the villa becomes a museum, the library a public treasure, and these whispers become historical curiosities rather than active weapons." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "But until then, we maintain the fiction that books are just books, walls just walls, and secrets just the product of a madman's imagination." November 5th brought the kind of crisp clarity that made Tuscany's hills stand out like engravings against the sky. Our restorer had been working since before dawn, carefully dismantling the final hollow binding to understand its construction completely. The craftsmanship still amazed him, each chamber carved with acoustic precision, the brass fittings so delicate they seemed more like jewelry than functional hardware. Marco had departed for the village to purchase supplies, leaving the library unusually quiet. Or rather, quiet of human presence. The whispers continued their endless circulation through hidden channels, carrying fragments of villa life like leaves on an underground stream. It was in this solitude that the restorer made his most disturbing discovery. Hidden within the hollow binding's deepest recess, wrapped in oiled silk, lay a document that changed everything. Not a confession or accusation, but a contract dated 1848, signed by the current count and sealed with Austrian diplomatic marks. The agreement was straightforward in its treachery. In exchange for covering his son's radical activities and ensuring they led nowhere dangerous, the Count would receive regular payments disguised as loans. Federico hadn't been killed to stop his revolutionary work. He'd been killed because he'd discovered his father had been controlling and sabotaging that work from the beginning, using the acoustic system to feed information to Austrian intelligence. The restorer set down the document with hands that trembled slightly. Every conversation the revolutionaries had conducted in the villa, every plan they discussed near the hidden listening points, the Count had heard it all, selling what was valuable, allowing what was harmless, ensuring the movement accomplished nothing that truly threatened the established order. Footsteps on marble interrupted his thoughts. The Count entered, but not alone. 2 Austrian officers accompanied him, their uniforms pristine, their expressions professionally neutral. The Count's face showed no surprise at finding the restorer with the document. "I wondered when you'd find that," he said conversationally. "Pietro came close, but he chose ignorance. You've chosen knowledge. Now you must choose what to do with it."
The senior officer, a captain with scars suggesting actual combat experience, spoke in accented Italian. "The restoration work is complete enough. You'll be paid in full, with a bonus for discretion.
Leave today, forget what you've learned, and continue your career elsewhere." "And if I refuse?" The captain's smile was winter cold. Pietro Galli refused initially. The asylum was a compromise. He could have simply disappeared. The Count moved to the window, his back to them all. "You judge me, I'm sure. The noble who betrayed his class, his son, his country's aspirations. But I preserved this library, this repository of 5 centuries of human thought. Revolutions burn libraries. Order preserves them." "Your son believed in something greater," the restorer said quietly. "My son believed in beautiful impossibilities. I dealt in ugly realities." The Count turned, and his face showed the exhaustion of years of self-justification. "Every month, I prevented bloodshed by revealing plans for uprisings that would have been crushed anyway. Every year, I saved lives by ensuring the revolution moved slowly enough that Austria could adapt rather than react with violence. You collaborated. I survived. The villa survived. The books survived." He gestured at the library surrounding them. "In 50 years, when Italy is united, and it will be, gradually, inevitably, these books will still be here. The knowledge they contain will outlast Austria, outlast revolution, outlast us all." The younger Austrian officer had been examining the hollow books with professional interest. "Remarkable engineering. We could use such systems elsewhere." "No," the Count said sharply. "The agreement was for information, not methods. The acoustic system stays here, dies here." A commotion from the courtyard drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Marco returning, but not alone. Don Bernardino accompanied him, along with several men from the village, including the wounded revolutionary from weeks before. They moved with purpose that suggested this wasn't a social call. "It seems your assistant has complicated loyalties," the captain observed. Lucia appeared in the doorway, her usual composure intact despite the tension. "Excellence, Don Bernardino insists on speaking with you. He says it concerns your son's papers, documents Federico left in the chapel that the priest has finally decided to share." The Count's face went pale. The Austrian officers exchanged glances, hands moving subtly toward their sidearms. The restorer understood. Federico had hidden evidence of his father's betrayal, insurance against the very situation now unfolding. "Shall we receive them here?" Lucia asked innocently, though her eyes met the restorer's with clear message: "Choose your side now." The library had become a stage for convergence. Revolutionaries ascending from below, Austrians positioned above, the Count trapped between them. And at the center, the books containing their hollow chambers and centuries of whispers, waiting to amplify whatever words came next. Don Bernardino entered first, his priest's cassock lending him authority that transcended political divisions. "Count Monteverdi, I've come to hear your confession. This is neither the time nor place. On the contrary, this is precisely the time and place. Your son confessed to me before his death. He knew about your arrangement with the Austrians, documented it thoroughly. Those documents are now in the bishop's hands, sealed unless I fail to send word by evening."
The Austrian captain's hand moved to his pistol. "Priest or not, you're threatening an agent of the Empire." "I'm offering a sinner the chance for redemption," Don Bernardino replied calmly.
The Count can confess publicly, allowing truth to flow freely, or he can maintain his lies and watch that truth emerge anyway, destroying not just him, but everyone connected to this house. The restorer found himself moving almost without conscious decision, positioning himself between the various parties. "There's another option," he said, surprising himself with his calm. "The acoustic system that made this situation possible can also resolve it." He lifted one of the hollow books, demonstrating its resonance. "These chambers amplify truth and lies equally. What if we used them to create a different narrative, one where the Count discovered his son's revolutionary activities and, torn between loyalty to order and love for his child, chose a middle path that saved lives even as it compromised principles?" The Count looked at him with something like hope. "You're suggesting we revise history?" "I'm suggesting we complete it."
History is always incomplete, always missing voices that were silenced or never recorded. The acoustic system captured fragments. Let's use those fragments to build a truth that serves everyone. November 10th dawned gray and uncertain, matching the mood within Villa Monteverdi. The Austrian officers had departed in the night, their report carefully crafted to suggest the Count's diminishing usefulness as an intelligence asset. Don Bernardino had returned Federico's documents to their hiding place, unused but not destroyed. The revolutionaries had melted back into the countryside, their plans adjusted but not abandoned. And at the center of it all, our restorer continued his work, though the nature of that work had fundamentally changed. He stood with Marco and Lucia in the library's heart, surrounded by the carefully mapped acoustic system. The decision had been made collectively, though no one had explicitly stated it. The listening mechanism would be disabled. Its power to corrupt and control finally ended. "We start with the nullification chambers," the restorer explained, consulting his architectural notes. "If we reverse their construction, they'll disperse sound rather than trap it, making the speaking tubes useless for eavesdropping." Marco had brought tools from the village blacksmith, implements more suited to demolition than restoration. Yet even in destruction, the restorer insisted on craft, on careful dismantling that preserved the library's structural integrity while eliminating its surveillance capabilities. The Count watched from his chair, a bottle of wine at his elbow, his face showing the peculiar peace of someone who'd finally stopped fighting fate. "My grandfather would be appalled," he said, words slightly slurred. 3 generations of controlled information, ended by a book restorer with principles." "Your grandfather lived in different times," Lucia replied, carefully removing brass fittings from the walls. "He built this system to preserve power through knowledge. But power preserved this way rots from within, like books kept in airless rooms." They worked through the morning, methodically disconnecting tubes, filling hollow spaces with wool and plaster, transforming the villa's walls from conductors of secrets to simple barriers between rooms. With each sealed connection, the whispers grew fainter, until finally only normal sounds remained. Footsteps, voices at natural volume, the wind through windows. Don Bernardino arrived at midday with unexpected news. "The bishop has made a decision about Federico's documents. They're to be sealed in the church archives for 50 years. By then, he reasons, Italy will be unified, the Austrians gone, and these revelations will be history rather than scandal. The Count laughed bitterly. Even the Church plays the long game with truth. The Church has centuries of practice balancing revelation with stability, the priest replied. We've learned that immediate truth often serves neither justice nor mercy. As they worked, the restorer found himself thinking about Pietro Galli, choosing madness over complicity. In the asylum, surrounded by actual madmen, Pietro had found a kind of peace. Here in the villa, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge and betrayal, peace seemed impossible. It was Lucia who voiced what they all felt. We're not just dismantling pipes and chambers. We're ending an era where information was currency and secrets were weapons. And beginning what? Marco asked, his young voice uncertain. Beginning an era where books are just books, the restorer said, though he wondered if such innocence was possible. Every library contained secrets. Every collection reflected its collector's obsessions and compromises. The difference was that most libraries didn't literally whisper their secrets through the walls. By late afternoon, they'd reached the attic listening post, that central chamber where all sounds had converged. The Count insisted on accompanying them, climbing the narrow stairs with difficulty, breathing hard from exertion and wine. I spent so many hours here, he said, running his hands over the brass tube openings. First, listening to my father receive his Austrian payments. Then, to my wife's prayers for my soul. Finally, to Federico planning the future he'd never see. He pulled out a pocket knife, began scratching something into the wooden beam. Let there be a record, at least. He carved carefully. Here died the architecture of suspicion, November 10th, 1853. The dismantling of the listening post was almost ceremonial. Each removed tube rang like a bell as it separated from its housing, a funeral toll for the surveillance state the old Count had created. When the last connection was severed, the silence was profound, not the pregnant silence of held secrets, but the clean silence of genuine privacy. Returning to the library, they found an unexpected visitor. The wounded revolutionary from weeks before, now healed, carrying a leather satchel. We're leaving the area, he announced. The Austrians are increasing patrols, and our work must continue elsewhere. But first, a gift. From the satchel, he produced a newly printed book, Mazzini's latest treatise on Italian unification. For the collection. Let the library contain dreams of freedom, alongside its histories of control. The Count accepted the book with shaking hands. Federico would have appreciated the irony. His revolution continues, just without him. Revolutions always continue, the man replied. The question is whether they're heard or whispered, open or secret, honest or corrupted by the very systems they claim to oppose. That evening, they gathered in the library for a meal, an unusual mixing of classes and purposes that would have been unthinkable weeks before. The Count had opened his last bottles of good wine, claiming bankruptcy made hoarding pointless. Don Bernardino offered grace that somehow encompassed both gratitude and grief. Lucia had prepared a feast from the villa's diminishing stores, each dish a small rebellion against austerity. To Pietro Galli, the restorer proposed, raising his glass, who chose madness over complicity. To Federico Monteverdi, Don Bernardino added, who died believing in tomorrow. To the books,
the Count said finally, which will outlive us all, carrying our follies and wisdom forward without judgment. They drank, and in the library's new silence, free from whispers, from surveillance, from the weight of mechanical omniscience, they could finally hear what had always been there. The simple sounds of human connection, fragile but real, temporary but precious. Marco, emboldened by wine and the evening's strange democracy, asked, "What happens now? With the villa, the library, all of us?" The Count smiled sadly. "The villa will be sold to pay debts, probably to some merchant wanting aristocratic prestige. The library will be dispersed, its volumes scattered to collectors who won't know they once formed an acoustic weapon. As for us, we'll become what we were always meant to be, without the distortion of artificial listening." "And the restoration?" Marco asked the restorer. "Will be completed," he assured the boy. "Every damaged volume repaired, every broken binding restored. When the collection is dispersed, at least the books themselves will be whole, even if their context is lost." The candles burned low as conversation continued, ranging from philosophy to farming, revolution to recipes. For these few hours, the villa's rigid hierarchies dissolved, replaced by something more genuine, if less permanent. November 20th painted the Tuscan hills with winter's first suggestion, a thin frost that turned the villa's gardens silver in the morning light. Our restorer stood in the library one last time, his work complete, his tools packed, the books restored to dignity, if not to their former power. The hollow bindings had been carefully filled with conservation-grade padding, preserving their unusual construction as historical curiosity rather than functional apparatus. Marco helped him wrap the more delicate volumes in tissue paper, preparing them for the journey to their new homes. The boy had grown during these weeks, his hands steadier, his understanding deeper than mere technical skill could account for. He'd learned that restoration involved more than repairing damage. It required knowing which scars to preserve as testimony. "Will you take an apprentice in your next position?" Marco asked, hope barely concealed. The restorer smiled, remembering his own youth, the hunger for knowledge that went beyond mere craft. "If that apprentice understands that books contain more than words, and libraries hold more than books, then yes." The Count entered, dressed for travel in clothes that had been carefully brushed but couldn't hide their age. The sale documents were signed. A Florentine banker had purchased Villa Monteverde, planning to convert it into a rural retreat for wealthy merchants seeking aristocratic atmosphere. The library would be auctioned in lots, its unity dissolved but its individual volumes preserved. "I've arranged for certain books to remain together," the Count said, producing a list. "The Dante volumes, the architectural treatises, a few others. They'll go to the University of Florence with an endowment for their care. Federico would have wanted public access, even if he couldn't have imagined this form of it." Lucia appeared with coffee in the morning's correspondence. She wore traveling clothes as well, having accepted a position managing a boarding house in Florence, a descent in status, but an ascent in independence. The restorer noticed how her fingers lingered on his when she handed him a letter. "From Pietro," she said. "The doctors allowed him to write once he learned the acoustic system was dismantled." The letter was brief but lucid. "The books no longer whisper, so perhaps I need no longer be mad. Though madness, I've discovered, has its own integrity. When the world itself seems insane, the asylum becomes a refuge of honest delusion."
I tend my roses and teach other patients to read. It's not unlike restoration work, returning damaged things to functionality, if not to their original state. Don Bernardino conducted a final service in the villa's chapel that afternoon, blessing the house and its departing inhabitants. His sermon took its text from Ecclesiastes, "For everything there is a season." But his real message was more complex, about the necessity of both memory and forgetting, preservation and release. This villa has heard centuries of prayers, confessions, conspiracies, and conversations, he said. Now it will hear new voices, unburdened by the weight of mechanical memory. The walls will still contain echoes, but natural ones, honest ones, free from the corruption of systematic surveillance. The banker arrived in early afternoon with his assessors, eager to examine his purchase. A small, energetic man who'd made his fortune in textile trade. He walked through the rooms with proprietary satisfaction, already planning renovations. When he reached the library, now stripped of its secret purpose, he saw only valuable books and handsome shelves. "Magnificent," he declared, "though I'll convert this to a ballroom. Books are all well and good, but what use is a room where conversation is discouraged?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, though no one commented. The room that had been designed to capture every conversation would become a space for public discourse, its acoustic properties serving dancing and music rather than surveillance. As afternoon faded toward evening, the restorer made his final rounds. In each section of the library, he'd left small marks, tiny symbols in places only another craftsman would look, documenting both the restoration work and the hidden history. Someday, perhaps, another restorer would find them and wonder at the story they suggested. He found the Count in his study, burning papers in the fireplace with methodical care, not frantically, as one might expect, but thoughtfully, reading each document before consigning it to flames. "The transcripts," the Count explained, "3 generations of overheard conversations. They deserve the privacy death couldn't give them." He held up one page covered in his father's writing. "Here's a conversation between 2 servants, discussing their fear that the old Count could hear their thoughts. They were more right than they knew. When you hear everything someone says, you can predict their thoughts with disturbing accuracy." "Will you tell the banker about the acoustic system?" "What system?" "We filled some old damage in the walls, repaired some deteriorated plaster. If he discovers brass tubes, they're simply antiquated ventilation. If he wonders why some books were unusually heavy, well, old binding techniques were sometimes excessive." The Count smiled grimly. "The truth will become legend. Legend will become folklore. Folklore will become a ghost story told to guests at his parties." The final dinner was simple: bread, cheese, wine, and preserves from the villa's stores. They ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, servants and nobility sharing the same table one last time. Conversation was sporadic, everyone conscious this was an ending. "Where will you go?" Lucia asked the restorer. "Venice first, to report to the collectors who recommended me. Then perhaps south. Naples has libraries damaged by revolution and time. There's always work for someone who can make old things functional again." "And you?" he asked in return. "Florence is full of foreigners seeking authentic Italian experiences. I'll give them comfortable rooms and stories edited for their sensibilities." My own small restoration work, making the past palatable for the present. As the evening deepened, they dispersed to their final tasks. Don Bernardino returned to the village, carrying certain books the Count had donated to the parish. Marco helped load the restorer's tools and materials onto the cart that would depart at dawn. The Count retired to his empty study to spend his last night as master of a villa that had mastered him. The restorer found himself alone with Lucia in the library, surrounded by books that would soon scatter across Italy like seeds on wind. She stood close enough that he could smell lavender in her hair, feel the warmth of her presence in the cooling room. "In another life," she said softly, "we might have had time. In another life, we might never have met. It took this strange convergence, revolution and restoration, secrets and revelations, to bring us to the same place." She kissed him once, gently, a gesture that was both greeting and farewell.
Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the books and the profound silence of walls that no longer listened. He spent that last night reading, choosing volumes at random, finding margin notes and pressed flowers, receipts used as bookmarks, and love letters hidden between pages. Each book contained its own small history, independent of the grand narrative of surveillance and betrayal. These individual stories would survive the collection's dispersal, traveling to new shelves where they'd accumulate new histories, new secrets, new silences. Dawn came slowly, painting the library gold one final time. The restorer closed the last book, stood, and stretched muscles stiff from sitting. Outside, Marco waited with the loaded cart, eager for the journey toward his apprenticeship and whatever future it might bring. The Count stood in the doorway, looking older but somehow lighter, as if releasing the villa's secrets had released him as well. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the restoration, yes, but more for the demolition. Some things need to be unmade before healing can begin." They shook hands, craftsman and aristocrat, equal in this moment of ending and beginning. Then the restorer climbed onto the cart, and Marco clicked at the horses, and they rolled away from Villa Monteverde, leaving it to its silence and its future. Behind them, the library stood empty of whispers but full of books, each volume a small fortress of knowledge, waiting to be opened, read, and understood on its own terms, without the mediation of hollow chambers and hidden listeners. The books would outlive them all, carrying forward not the secrets they'd been forced to amplify, but the stories they'd been meant to tell. The road to Florence stretched ahead, winter approaching but not yet arrived. And somewhere between the past they were leaving and the future they approached, our restorer found himself thinking not of the mysteries he'd solved, but of the ones that remained. How people could build such elaborate systems to avoid simple conversation. How truth could be more dangerous than lies. How restoration sometimes meant knowing what should remain broken.